So Carnival of Monsters is a very different serial to what we've seen before with Pertwee Space Stories, as it doesn't involve the Time Lords in any way. We've also got the beginning of a longer story which will continue through the next few serials, as they are all somewhat connected. So let's see what this serial has to offer. The serial starts off strong with us immediately being introduced to the planet this serial takes place on, although this creates a bit of a mystery when we meet the Doctor and Joe as they land on a ship on Earth. Having this mystery for the audience is somewhat interesting as it makes the serial feel a bit disconnected until the cliffhanger, when it connects these two seemingly different worlds. Despite this being a cliffhanger reveal, the serial does give enough of an explanation of the miniscope in the first part to hint that these two locations are the same before the cliffhanger, with the audience just needing to work it out. These two sections of the serial do meet up eventually, but for the most part remain somewhat separate, although the actions of those outside the miniscope do have some effect on those inside. The story inside the miniscope is quite a scary one when you think about it, as we see characters trapped in seemingly endless loops where their behaviour can only be altered by the people outside, making them more aggressive for their own amusement, with them being completely unaware of it. This leaves the Doctor and Joe trapped as the only ones able to see what is actually happening and having to relive events somewhat and plan around them in order to get through and escape. This is a somewhat unique element in the serial, as we haven't seen a time loop in the show before, even though it is a small element of the overall story. So let's talk about the miniscope itself and why it exists. So within the serial, it's a plot device so that the Doctor and Joe can be shrunken down and trapped inside, while facing the creatures inside alongside the people outside. Now beyond both being a plot device and a part of the setting, it also serves to be used as a form of commentary, that being about zoos. While I can't find any external sources to back this up, the dialogue implies the idea that this was at least partly written as a commentary. The main culprit of this is the fact that the Doctor and Joe both find the fact that it's like a zoo to be a horrible thought, and the fact that the Doctor talks about how he forced the Time Lords to outlaw them. While the serial doesn't go too deep into this idea, it isn't that subtle in saying how animals are used for entertainment instead of being left to roam their natural habitats. There is one problem with this, and that's the serial doesn't go too deep into the people who run the zoos or own the miniscopes, with the owner of this one not being seen as a villain. While yes, the two performers aren't always the most moral of people, they aren't villains in the way you'd expect of a commentary. Vorg and Shurna are quite reasonable people, and don't really have much thoughts about the people within the miniscope, whether that be good or bad. It's just a bit odd that the focus is more on the miniscope itself rather than the people operating it, although the serial does somewhat excuse them as it's something that Vorg recently won. The main villains instead are the inhabitants of the planet that Vorg and Shurna are visiting, with Caleb being the one who wants to rid his planet of all alien life due to his own paranoia, with him planning to use the Drashigs to overthrow their ruler, which is his own brother. The fact that the actual villain is unrelated to what appears to be commentary is definitely weird. So let's talk about Calec now, who is somewhat interesting. As stated before, he wants to overthrow his brother, the President, and take control of the planet so he can prevent aliens from coming to their world. So while I do say he's somewhat interesting, due to the focus of the serial being on the miniscope, it does mean that he doesn't get much time in the spotlight, especially since he has to share it with two others of his race, Pletrax and Aurum. These two are also interesting, but definitely the secondary of their race, with Aurum being a bit of a coward who ends up working with whoever is the most powerful in any situation for his own safety, while Pletrax is a politician who supports the President. These three aren't the best characters in the serial, as while they do have some great dialogue, they do feel secondary to the rest of the characters, which Holmes is clearly having more fun writing for. It's not that they are played being very much purposely isolated and is finally opening up to other races isn't interesting, but it's more so the starting point for the serial's events rather than the big thing which is explored by the serial. We don't even meet the often discussed President of the planet, which while isn't necessarily a bad thing, we only see a small bit of their society, which does show us a lot, including the basic slave labour they have in the form of a secondary species, who do try to rise up against their oppressors on occasion. The most compelling characters are obviously Vorg and Shurna, who just steal the show. This would be the first time that Holmes really went all in with comedy characters, and would be the first of many comedy duos that he would write. As a duo they bounce off each other perfectly, with Vorg being someone who speaks very highly of himself, and definitely doesn't live up to the image of himself, who he describes himself to be, with even Shurna after being surprised by the truth. Their constant back and forth as Vorg tries to make a case for him to stay on the planet, as they're now completely broke due to him spending the last of their money on the tickets, is very entertaining to watch. Their general fun nature, which comes from the fact that they're entertainers, combined with Holmes' humorous dialogue, makes them the standouts of the serial. A good moment is when Vorg thinks the Doctor is a fellow carnival man, and tries to speak the lingo with him, which even in the TARDIS seems incapable of translating, and allows the more serious nature of the Doctor to bounce directly off someone completely unserious. Although Varg does get to be the hero at the end when he kills the escaped Drashig, which was released through a combination of the Doctor's own escape and later Calec's meddling. So let's talk about the creatures in the miniscope, as I've mentioned the Drashigs a few times. So we only meet two races, the Drashigs alongside the humans on the ship, but we do know that a few more of the creatures kept inside the miniscope include an Ogron and a Cyberman. Notably, this is the only appearance of a Cyberman in the Third Doctor's era, as they don't have their own serial. The Ogron is also described as a servant of the Daleks, which does work as setup for the next serial, but we'll get to that in time. The main ones are of course the humans who are trapped, with them being on the ship the SS Bernice, which went mysteriously missing in the year 1926, although by the end of the serial it is returned returned, which means that this serial does actually change history despite not being set on Earth. The ship is entirely fictional, as far as I'm aware, which means that it doesn't have the same impact of the ship being famous like the Mary Celeste in The Chase, although that doesn't necessarily detract from it. We only meet 3 people on this ship, those being John Andrews, Major Daly, and his daughter Claire Daly. Andrews is a member of the crew, while the other 2 are passengers, with the Major being used entirely for comedy, which makes him the most fun to watch. Although Andrews and Claire do have a bit of a relationship forming, which is made somewhat tragic by the time loop element, as they are trapped in a single meal and walk. This area is where a lot of the serial's action occurs, as it's the place where the TARDIS lands, with the Doctor and Joe being trapped in it for an episode and a half. Then later in the serial they return to it with Joe becoming trapped while the Drashigs invade. The 3 humans are fun characters and are used to demonstrate the power of the miniscope, as they are easily controlled by it, with them having to repeat the same actions over and over without knowing, and later when they are made aggressive by the machine, leading to a fist fight between the Doctor and Andrews. I do have to note though that Andrews was played by Ian Marter, who previously auditioned for the role of Yates but didn't get it, although this won't be the last time we talk about Marter in the show. The Drashigs on the other hand aren't interesting, but really cool. Acting as the immediate threat for a decent chunk, they are creatures which are incredibly dangerous, with a lot of time being spent on describing how dangerous they are, and what they are capable of. The way they are used in the serial is good, as they're just a mindless threat which increases the tension without there having to be a strong humanoid villain within the miniscope. The design is also really good, with them feeling very real, although there are a few CSO shots which don't look as good. The constant threat from them does make them a powerful force, as there is seemingly no way of stopping them, but of course a way is found, with Vor killing the ones that escaped. The final people to talk about are of course the main duo, who are very strong. The Doctor gets plenty of opportunities to show off his intelligence, as we see him figuring out what the miniscope is from inside, and later making a machine which is capable of returning everything trapped inside it, which technically means that this was the only time he saves a Cyberman from death. We also get him taking part in a boxing match, which shows him fighting in a different way to his usual Venusian Aikido. We also learned about his history with the miniscope as explained before, with him forcing the Time Lords to take action to ban them. This is a bit of an eye-opener about his personal history, as we don't really know much about his past from before he left his home planet, with this showing a more moral side to him which wouldn't have been expected of his earliest incarnation, based on how he was when we first met him. In fact, this history sort of runs counter to his original arc, which clearly comes from how he evolved as a character and how the newer writers have ended up seeing the character. We also learned something important about the sonic screwdriver, that it's not able to open mechanical locks, with the Doctor saying that it's not an option when they're locked up in episode 1. It's interesting to see such a strong rule introduced to the show, and it's clearly a way to make the sonic not a device which can be used to escape any situation, although this is something which will tragically change over time. Last up is Jo, who is really good here. Due to how events play out, it means that she and the Doctor are split up for a bit, and it works well. The serial gives her a lot of opportunity to show off, with a notable one being when they're locked up in the cabin and she pulls out skeleton keys, which lets them escape. This is something she did back in Terror of the Autons to open the bomb, but it feels more like her personality leading her to having these, as during the previous time this happened, she was under the Master's control. So to me it always felt like a set of keys that was given to her, although it is odd that she never uses these keys on more occasions. Another great bit is when she's alone on the ship, and has to live within the situation as things begin to spiral out of control, and the crew continue not to recognise her time after time. It's a fun serial for her where she doesn't feel like a spare part, and although doesn't take part in the resolution of the plot, plays key parts in earlier sections. So let's talk about the behind the scenes there, with there being 2 things I want to talk about. The first being Major Daly, or rather the man playing him, Tennille Evans. The reason for his notability is that he was suggested for the role by Pertwee himself, as they were old friends, and it was Evans who had suggested that Pertwee audition for the role of the Doctor, without the knowledge that the BBC were already considering him. So this means that Evans played a potentially big part in Pertwee's decision to take the role, and now the favour has come full circle. The only other thing I want to mention is the chickens, or more specifically their voices, as the chicken noises weren't recordings of actual chickens, and instead the noises were made by Katie Manning, who is surprisingly good at making chicken noises. The last thing to talk about is that this is the beginning of a season-long arc, with the Doctor trying to get Jo to Metebelis free. This is something which connects the remaining stories of this season, as all feature the Doctor trying to get there, and their attempts to get there leading them into trouble. In the case of this serial, the TARDIS goes off course and ends up in the miniscope, with the Doctor being sure they're either on the blue planet or nearby, but seemingly are nowhere near, although this serial doesn't address how far off they were. This arc was meant to begin with the 3 Doctors, with a line about the Doctor wanting to take Jo there, but this was cut, and so it's first mentioned in this serial. So Carnival of Monsters was a different serial to what we've become used to. Apart from taking the 3rd Doctor off Earth without the Time Lord's intervention, it also gives us a bit about the Doctor's history and his place in his people's society from before he left. It's a fun serial which does seem to be about zoos, but at the same time doesn't feel like it's committed to that commentary, with there being a stronger focus on humour instead. It feels like a breath of fresh air after the previous season, and works well as the beginning of a trilogy of sorts that takes the Doctor off of Earth. But with the Doctor and Jo return to normal size, they attempt to return to Earth, but end up crashing into a ship which is attacked by Draconians, although not as all as it seems, as a plot to start a war between 2 great empires is being put into motion. Next time, Frontier in Space.